No one in the rescue convoy could understand why an orphaned elephant would leave everything behind to follow their trucks, yet panic so violently over one rusted iron bell hanging from his neck. To them, it looked like useless junk, something that should have been removed right away. What they didn't know was that the bell was more than metal. It was memory, grief, and the last trace of a young creature who had lost his mother, lost his herd, and somehow taught himself how to speak just to survive. And once the truth came out, no one would ever look at that bell the same way again. The rescue convoy had already started to roll when the sound rose behind it, thin at first, then strangely steady, a hollow metallic knock that did not belong to any toolbox, fuel can, or loose chain in the truck beds. Dust drifted through the morning light as the engines pulled forward, and every head in the lead vehicle turned at once, searching for the source of it. Dr. Rebecca Cole twisted in her seat and looked through the smeared rear window. Out on the red road, half hidden by dust, a young elephant calf was following the convoy at a determined, uneven pace. His ears fluttered with each step, his trunk swung low, and around his narrow neck hung a rusted iron bell that struck against his chest with every stride. He was too small to look threatening, and too exhausted to look wild in the way healthy calves did. But there was something unsettling in the way he moved after the trucks, as if he had already made a decision no human being had been invited to question. He did not trumpet. He did not hurry blindly. He simply kept coming, one measured footfall after another. Ethan Pike, the youngest field assistant on the team, muttered that the bell had to be cutting into the calf's skin. Before Rebecca could answer, he jumped down from the flatbed with the practical confidence of someone trying to fix the most visible problem first. The convoy slowed. Dust curled around his boots. The calf stopped a few yards away and watched him come closer. The bell rope was old leather, dark with sweat, frayed at one edge where it had rubbed for months against moving skin. Ethan reached toward it slowly, palm open, voice soft, the way rescuers did when they wanted an animal to accept help. For a breath, the calf did not move. Then he took 3 steps back, spread his ears wide, and fixed Ethan with a stare so sharp it froze him in place. It was not the panic of a cornered animal. It was something stranger, more deliberate. The calf's body trembled, but he did not turn to run. He guarded that rusted bell as if the boy's hand had come too close to a wound no one else could see. The silence around them tightened. Even the idling engine seemed to grow quieter, while Ethan looked back toward Rebecca for instruction. Rebecca lifted one hand from the cab window. "Leave it." That was all the gesture meant, and Ethan understood. He stepped away, uneasy now, no longer looking at the bell as a harmless piece of junk. The calf kept his eyes on him until he climbed back onto the truck. Only then did the small elephant shift his weight, and the bell answered with one lonely, metallic knock. The convoy moved again. Rebecca expected the calf to drift away once the trucks picked up speed, but the sound of the bell followed them down the road, steady as a heartbeat. A local ranger named Simon Dube, riding in the second vehicle, swore under his breath and said he had never seen a calf shadow a departing convoy like that, not without a mother nearby, not without panic. For nearly 200 yards, the little elephant stayed behind them, his feet slipping in the ruts, dust coating his lashes, that bell marking every stubborn step. Then, without warning, he broke into an awkward run. One of the rear tires kicked gravel as he came alongside the last truck, bumped once against the tailgate, and somehow hauled himself up into the bed among feed sacks and coiled rope. The entire convoy lurched to a stop. Ethan half rose as if to push him back down, but Rebecca's voice cut through the confusion before he could move. "Don't!" The calf had already folded himself into the corner beside a water crate, breathing hard, legs tucked beneath him, as though he had finally reached the place he had been trying to reach since long before the trucks arrived. Up close, he looked even younger than Rebecca had guessed. There were healing scratches along his flank, mud packed into the creases above his toenails, and a dull abrasion beneath the bell strap where the iron had rubbed the same patch of skin over and over. Yet for all that discomfort, he angled his body protectively around the bell, keeping it turned away from every reaching hand. No one in the convoy understood what they were seeing. The calf had not fought being near humans. He had not resisted the truck, the noise, or the strange smell of fuel and canvas and medicine. But the moment anyone touched that bell, something inside him locked shut. Simon climbed up for a better look and quietly said the animal must have belonged to someone once. Rebecca was not so sure. She watched the calf lower his head until the bell rested against the wooden bed, as if he were trying to still its voice by force. His eyes moved from face to face, searching, weighing, waiting for something none of them knew how to offer. Rebecca had handled orphaned predators, burned primates, even a zebra foal that refused to stand for 3 days. This felt different from the start. When the convoy finally rolled forward again, the calf did not try to escape. He stayed curled between the supply crates while the road stretched out toward the open scrub, and every now and then the truck hit a rut hard enough to make the rusted bell chime once in the warm morning air. Rebecca listened to that sound longer than she meant to, already sensing that whatever it meant, it had followed him out of grief and into her care. Before the convoy reached the main highway, the calf had stopped looking at the people around him and turned inward, as if he had retreated to some private place none of them could enter. His body swayed with the truck's motion, but he never fully relaxed. Each jolt made the rusted bell tap softly against the boards beneath him, and each sound seemed to pull him farther into memory. 13 months earlier, before the rescue trucks and the dust and Dr. Rebecca Cole's sharp, watchful eyes, he had stood beside his mother in the remains of a storm. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the ground slick and black beneath a bruised gray sky. She was lying on her side near a broken fence line, massive and still. While flies gathered at the corners of wounds, he did not understand. He had stayed pressed against her shoulder until morning, nudging her with his forehead, then with his trunk, then with the full weight of his small body, as if force alone might call her back. When the wind shifted, her scent had already begun to change. It frightened him, though he did not know why. She was there, and yet not there, and the world around them had lost its shape. The land felt wrong without her movement in it. No low rumble guided him. No broad body blocked the light. No living wall stood between him and the strange smells drifting from the human fields nearby. He had cried out until his throat felt raw, then gone silent from exhaustion. By the time the old man found him, the calf had become little more than a trembling shadow beside a body that was growing cold. Walter Hayes had not come looking for elephants that morning. He had followed the collapsed section of electric fence to see what the storm had torn apart and whether the cattle beyond the ridge had wandered through. What he found instead was a dead cow elephant, scorched wire dragging in the mud, and a calf too young to understand that staying close could not undo what had happened. The calf had tried to stand between Walter and his mother's body, awkward and desperate, ears half spread, knees shaking. He could barely hold his ground, but he did not move aside. Walter stopped several feet away and said nothing at first. The old man smelled of engine oil, wet canvas, and stale coffee. In one hand, he carried pliers. In the other, a coil of fence wire. Neither thing meant comfort. For a long minute, the two of them stayed exactly where they were. The old man breathing hard from the walk, the calf staring through a veil of rainwater and dirt. Then Walter slowly set both tools on the ground. He took off his hat. What came out of him was not a command or a soothing sound, just one rough sentence spoken to the empty air. "Well, hell," he whispered. "Aren't you alone?" The calf did not understand the words, but he understood the change in posture. The man no longer looked like danger advancing. He looked like something weary and sad that had seen ruin before. When Walter stepped nearer, the calf flinched and nearly slipped in the mud, but he was too weak to run. Hunger had already hollowed him out. Grief had taken the rest. Walter could see how bad it was. The calf's sides were sunken, his eyes dull with fatigue, his trunk hanging low except for those brief, frantic touches against his mother's hide. There were track marks everywhere, boots, dragged wire, tire grooves from the farm vehicle that had likely come after the storm. Whatever panic had killed the mother had happened fast. Whatever came next for the calf would happen slowly. He did not lead the calf away all at once. First, he cut the broken wire loose from the dead elephant's legs so it would not snag the little one when he circled back. Then he returned with 2 dented water jugs from his truck and poured some into a shallow metal pan. The calf ignored it at first. He stayed where he was, touching the same lifeless shoulder over and over, as though repetition might change the answer. By midday, heat began to rise off the soaked earth, and the smell of the carcass thickened. Vultures appeared in widening circles overhead. Walter knew what would come after that. He also knew the calf would not survive another night beside the body, not with hyenas moving through the flats after dark, and no herd within earshot. He made a call on the crackling ranch radio, but no one answered from the wildlife office. That was when the old man made the kind of decision people later liked to call compassionate, though in truth it was born out of urgency and ignorance more than wisdom. He fetched an old trailer blanket from his truck, draped it over part of the mother's face to break the calf's line of sight, then stood near the water pan and waited. The little elephant watched him, miserable and uncertain, but finally took one step away from the body. It was not trust. Not yet. It was thirst, confusion, and the faint instinct to move toward the only living thing that had not tried to drive him off. By sunset, the calf had followed Walter's truck at a distance all the way to the abandoned pump station where the old man lived, stopping whenever the truck stopped, refusing to come too close, refusing to turn back. His legs shook with every step, but he kept going. Walter settled him in the patch of scrub behind the pump tower where the ground stayed dry and the windbreak held off some of the night chill. He set out water, cut branches, and an old horse trough that smelled of rust and mineral dust. The calf stood there under the dim yellow porch light, too tired to protest, too lost to understand safety when it finally appeared. Somewhere in the dark, coyotes called to one another. Long after the old man went inside, the calf remained awake, staring into the night with wide, strained eyes. Every sound made him tense. Every gust of wind against the tin siding pulled his head up in alarm. Near midnight, he gave a soft, broken cry, not loud enough to carry far, but enough to tell the empty dark that he had not chosen any of this. There was no answer, only the creak of the old pump and the settling boards. Near dawn, when the first pale light touched the far fence posts, Walter stepped back outside, carrying a dented iron bell and a strip of worn leather. He had not yet tied it around the calf's neck. He only stood there turning it in his hands, studying the young elephant with the grave expression of a man who knew he was about to improvise his way into a bond neither of them was ready for. By the third morning, the calf had learned the shape of Walter Hayes's footsteps long before the old man came into view. There was a scrape of boot leather on packed dirt, then the faint clink of tools in Walter's hand, then the tired human cough that always arrived before sunrise. The calf would lift his head at those sounds, still wary, still uncertain, but no longer frozen by every sign of approach. Walter moved slowly around him, never trying to force closeness. He brought water in dented buckets, cut branches from thorn trees, and sometimes stood with one hand on his hip, as if studying a machine he had never been trained to fix. The calf watched everything. His hunger kept him near the trough. His grief kept him restless. He drank, nibbled leaves, then turned his head toward the empty horizon as though waiting for something larger than morning. It was on that same morning that Walter finally stepped close enough to lift the old iron bell. The leather strap had once belonged to a mule harness, darkened with age and softened by years of weather. The calf flinched when Walter raised his hands, but he was too weak to bolt far. He backed 3 paces, stumbled, and stopped. Walter spoke in a low voice that meant nothing in words and everything in tone. The bell settled against the calf's narrow chest with a small, flat knock. He shook his head at once, startled by the weight and the foreign sound. The iron answered him with a dull, metallic chime that seemed too loud for the quiet yard. He jerked again, ears twitching, trunk lifted, body tense. Walter stepped back immediately, palms open, giving him the space to fear it without adding fear of the man. For the rest of that day, the calf seemed offended by the bell's existence. Every movement made it speak. Every quick turn startled him with another burst of sound. He tried rubbing it against the fence post, then against the trough, then swinging his trunk beneath it as though he might pry it loose. But by dusk, fatigue had outlasted resistance. The bell remained where it was, and the little elephant stood beneath the pump tower, listening to its last few quiet taps fade into night. Walter's reason for the bell was simple, almost painfully practical. His left ear had never recovered after a rail yard explosion decades earlier, and age had only made the weakness worse. At night, when the wind pressed through the scrub and the generator coughed itself to sleep, he could not always trust his hearing or his eyes. If the calf wandered toward the drainage ditch, the wire traps, or the coyote trails, that bell might tell Walter what sight could miss. The calf did not know any of that, of course. What he knew was that the sound followed him. When he took a step, it came. When he lowered himself near the brush, it settled with him. When he woke from shallow sleep and lurched to his feet in panic, it answered immediately, letting him hear himself in the dark. Within days, the bell had become part of the map of his body, strange no longer, but not yet understood. Then, something shifted. One afternoon, Walter disappeared behind the storage shed longer than usual while repairing a broken line on the old pump. The calf drifted to the far edge of the yard, where the wind carried scents from dry grass and distant animals he could not see. He stopped, lifted his head, and listened. The old man's footsteps were gone. The yard felt empty in a way that made his chest tighten. He gave a sharp toss of his head without thinking. The bell rang twice. A moment later, from behind the shed, came Walter's answer. 2 knocks of a wrench against metal pipe. The calf froze. The sound was small, but it carried certainty. Someone was still there. He shook his head again, shorter this time, and heard the bell answer him. Then came Walter's knock once more, slower now, almost patient. Something inside the calf eased. After that, the pattern began to grow on its own. When the calf was hungry and Walter had not yet noticed, he would shake his head in 2 quick beats and wait. When something frightened him in the brush after dark, the bell burst into frantic motion before his feet even decided whether to run. And when Walter moved out of sight for too long, the calf learned he could call into the space between them and receive some sign that he had not been abandoned again. Walter noticed the change before he understood it. He started pausing in his work to listen, head tilted slightly, face lined with concentration. "That one's different," he muttered once after a series of quick, uneven rings. The calf stood by the trough, trunk low, eyes fixed on a pair of vultures circling the backfield. Walter followed his gaze, saw the birds, and nodded as if the small elephant had told him something worth knowing. The yard began to fill with these tiny exchanges. Walter tapped on water drums. He whistled through his teeth. Sometimes he called out in that rusty voice of his, and the calf answered with a deliberate movement of his head, not random anymore, but measured. Not words, not anything a scientist would have named, but the beginning of pattern, the beginning of dependence, the beginning of a language built from whatever was left to them. With each passing week, the calf grew steadier on his feet. He no longer slept, standing in terror through most of the night. He followed Walter from pump house to yard, from fence line to storage, shed close enough to hear the muttered human sounds that filled the old man's loneliness. The bell marked all of it. Its voice was there when he drank, when he rested, when he startled, when he searched. It stitched his movements to the world around him. Walter never said it aloud, but there were moments when he looked at the calf with an expression too raw to hide. Years earlier, he had buried a son old enough to borrow his tools and joke at the dinner table, then watched his marriage collapse under the weight of grief that neither of them knew how to speak. The pump station had been quiet ever since. Now every morning began with the sound of small movements outside, an iron answering life. The calf could not know any of Walter's history, only the fact of presence. Yet he had begun to guard that presence in his own way. When Walter's back seized one evening, and the old man dropped hard to one knee beside the trough, the calf sprang sideways in alarm, then whipped his head so violently the bell rang out across the whole yard. Walter sucked in air through his teeth, looked up, and gave a pained little laugh. "All right," he said. "I'm still here." By the end of that month, the bell no longer sounded like a burden hanging from the neck of a rescued animal. In that lonely patch of Botswana scrub, it had become something stranger and more intimate, a thread between a grieving calf and a weary old man who kept answering every time it called. But beyond the fences, the world had begun to notice the growing elephant, and not everyone believed that such a bond could end well. By the time the rains failed for the second straight month, the calf had grown large enough that his presence could no longer be mistaken for a temporary problem. He still moved with the uncertain grace of youth, but there was weight in him now, enough strength in his shoulders to lean through weak fencing, and enough curiosity to turn a quiet yard into trouble before dawn had fully broken. At first, the damage was small enough for people to forgive. A water bucket overturned, a patch of pumpkins crushed near the fence line. One morning, a row of bean plants flattened beneath round prints that Walter recognized before anyone else did. He apologized, repaired what he could, and promised the calf would stay closer to the pump station. But promises made in daylight did not always survive the long hunger of the night. The calf had begun to notice the difference between thorn browse and cultivated food. Out in the brush, survival tasted dry and bitter. In town, the gardens held sweetness: squash, melons, corn not yet fully hardened. One evening, he slipped past Walter while the old man was wrestling with a generator belt, and by sunrise he had torn through 2 kitchen plots and knocked over a rack of drying maize behind the church. The bell gave him away before anyone saw him. That was the bitter irony of it. Every nervous movement he made in the dark sent the iron clanging through the sleeping streets, waking dogs, children, and the thin, exhausted adults who had already been counting every bucket of water and every sack of grain. By the time Walter found him, the calf was standing in a vegetable patch, chewing calmly while lanterns flared to life all around them. No one fired a shot that night, but the shouting cut through the darkness hard enough to make the calf throw his head high and back away. He did not understand the words. He only understood anger moving toward him from every direction. The bell burst into frantic motion as he turned in circles, searching for Walter, and the old man pushed through the crowd with both hands raised, his voice hoarse as he pleaded for space. Among the faces lit by lantern glow was Nora Bennett, a widow with a small farm at the west edge of town, and a boy barely old enough to carry feed sacks. She had lost half her tomato crop to drought and the rest to baboons 2 weeks earlier. Now she stood in ruined soil with her jaw clenched so tightly it changed her face. "This isn't kindness anymore," she said. "This is us paying for your conscience." Walter tried to explain that the calf was still young, still unsettled, still learning the boundaries of a world he had never chosen. But even as he spoke, the elephant nudged a broken crate with one foot, and the bell answered with that hollow metallic note everyone in town had come to dread. It made the silence afterward worse, not better. There was no innocence left in the sound for the people who had begun losing sleep over it. The next morning, the damage spread beyond 1 yard. A goat pen had been pushed partly open during the night. A storage drum lay on its side near the schoolhouse. One little girl named May Bennett, Nora's daughter, had stumbled into an irrigation ditch when the bell rang suddenly outside her window before dawn. She was not badly hurt, but the bruise on her cheek became more powerful than any argument Walter could make. By noon, a crowd had formed at the feed warehouse near the center of town. Nobody had announced a meeting, but everyone came anyway, drawn by anger, fear, and the kind of fatigue that makes mercy feel expensive. The calf stayed near Walter at the edge of the square, shifting his weight from foot to foot, while the bell tapped softly with every nervous movement. It was the wrong sound in the wrong place, and every person there heard it differently than Walter did. Simon Doob, the local ranger who sometimes passed through on patrol, arrived halfway through the argument and tried to calm the room. He reminded them that killing a protected elephant, even a young one, would bring legal trouble none of them needed, but the law sounded thin against real hunger. Nora stood with one hand on her son's shoulder and said the sentence that settled over the building like smoke. Compassion doesn't feed children. Walter did not answer right away. He looked down at the calf beside him, at the dusty lashes, the scar beginning to form where the bell strap rubbed the same place each day, at the way the young elephant kept angling his body toward the old man whenever voices rose. He understood, in that brutal instant, that the town was no longer speaking about inconvenience. They were speaking about survival, the same way he had once done when he tied that bell on in the first place. The decision, when it came, was harsher for being reasonable. 72 hours. That was what the town would give him to contact wildlife rescue and have the calf removed. If no one came by then, people would protect their property however they saw fit. No one said exactly what that meant, and no one needed to. Walter nodded once because he had no argument strong enough to stand against the fear in that room. The calf sensed the shift before the crowd began to break apart. He lifted his head, ears twitching, trunk sampling the air thick with sweat and dust and resentment. Then he gave one sharp toss, and the bell rang out so suddenly that several people flinched. It was not loud, not really, but it sounded wrong, higher, thinner, almost desperate. Even Nora glanced at him then, and for one unsettled second, her anger made room for something more complicated. That evening, Walter worked the old ranch radio until static gave way to a broken line, and, at last, a voice from the regional wildlife office. He left 3 messages before anyone confirmed a convoy could come. The calf stayed close to the pump station while the sun went down, shadowing Walter from shed to porch to trough, the bell speaking in small, uneasy notes whenever the old man stepped too far ahead. Night settled warm and windless over the scrub. Then, sometime after midnight, Walter woke to the one thing he had come to fear more than noise. Silence. No restless shifting outside the house. No soft clink of iron against bone. No steady sign that the calf was still in the yard and still alive. He lay frozen for one heartbeat, then another, and by the time he reached for his boots, he already knew that whatever happened next would change both of them far more than the town ever could. Walter was outside before the porch boards had finished creaking beneath his weight. The night had that hard, breathless stillness that comes before dawn in dry country, when even the insects seem to hold back. He stood listening with one hand on the doorframe, waiting for the familiar sound that had marked every hour of his sleep for months. Nothing came. The silence felt larger than the yard. He called once, low at first, not wanting to startle the calf if he was only hidden in the dark beyond the trough. Then louder. The name he used was not one anyone else knew, just a rough, private sound he had fallen into over time, something closer to a hum than a word. No answering bell, no movement in the brush. The old man grabbed his flashlight, and the beam shook from the first step. The tracks were easy enough to find near the pump station, round fresh prints pressed into dust still cool from the night. But the calf had not wandered aimlessly. Walter saw that almost at once. The trail led north, beyond the rusted fuel drum, past the dry wash, toward the old migration corridor people in town only talked about when fences failed and crops disappeared. The direction alone tightened something cold inside his chest. The farther Walter walked, the less he trusted his own body. His lower back had been punishing him all week, and the uneven ground forced him to move slowly, one careful step at a time. But fear worked through him like borrowed strength. In the dark, every thorn snag sounded like a warning. Every shadow looked briefly alive. He kept stopping, lifting the flashlight, listening for even one accidental knock of iron. He found the first sign of trouble near a patch of scrub acacia where the ground dipped shallow and soft. There were drag marks there, then a burst of disturbed earth and the sharp print of a front foot driven deep. The calf had panicked at something. Walter crouched with a groan and touched the fresh mark, his fingers brushing dust still unsettled. For one terrible second, he pictured wire, blood, and the long unfinished work of losing another life he had tried to keep. Then he saw what had really happened. Hyena tracks. 3 of them, maybe 4, skirting the edge of the corridor, testing, circling, never fully committing. The calf had bolted, not been caught. Walter rose too fast, pain flashing white across his lower spine, and nearly dropped the flashlight. "Keep moving," he muttered into the dark, though whether he meant the calf or himself, he could not have said. The horizon had just begun to pale when he finally saw him. The calf was standing on a slight rise at the edge of the old corridor, motionless against the thinning night, his body turned toward the north. Beyond him stretched open country, then broken scrub, then the deeper, protected lands where wild herds still moved through old memory routes, older than any fence line. The bell hung silent because the little elephant was perfectly still. Walter did not call out this time. He walked the last few yards quietly and stopped beside him, both of them facing the same direction. From somewhere far off, so faint it might have been mistaken for wind, came a low, rolling vibration, more felt than heard. The calf lifted his head at once. It was the sound of elephants at distance, not near enough to promise safety, but near enough to awaken something in him that no human care could ever replace. For several long moments, he did not move. Walter could almost feel the struggle passing through that young body. The calf had grown strong enough to try, strong enough to follow the pull of his own kind into country no man could guide him through. But he was still too young, still carrying the habits of fear and dependence that grief had pressed into him. The wild was a calling. So was memory. So was the life waiting back at the pump station. Walter kept his hands at his sides. That was the hardest thing. He could have stepped closer, could have touched the bell, could have spoken and broken the spell in his own favor. Instead, he stood in the cold edge of dawn and let the decision belong to the creature who had already lost too much to human need. It was the first truly honest gift he had given the calf since that storm-broken morning by the fence. The calf shifted at last. One front foot moved, then the other. For a breath, Walter thought he had chosen the north. But instead of stepping deeper into the corridor, he turned in a slow arc until his body faced back toward the south, toward the pump tower, the trough, the patched shed roof, the old man who smelled of oil and dust and quiet persistence. When he took that first step home, the bell struck once, soft as grief. Walter let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. Relief came, first hard and selfish. Then guilt followed right behind it. The calf was returning not because the wild had rejected him, but because he was not yet ready to survive it alone. There was comfort in that choice, and shame too. Walter knew enough about love to understand that being needed was not the same thing as doing right. By the time the sun rose clear over the flats, they were walking side by side back toward the station. Not close enough to touch, not distant enough to doubt. The bell resumed its familiar rhythm with each small, deliberate step, and the sound moved through the cool morning air like something both fragile and stubborn. Twice the calf stopped and looked back north. Twice he kept going. Walter never once asked him to hurry. When they reached the yard, the world seemed almost unchanged. The trough still sat by the post. The generator cover still leaned crooked against the shed. A pair of guinea fowl scratched in the dust, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Before dawn, the calf drank long and deeply, then stood near the porch, where Walter lowered himself into the old chair with a wince, and stared out at him in tired silence. Neither of them rested much that day. The calf stayed closer than usual, following Walter from porch to shed to radio table, the bell giving short, uneasy notes whenever the old man stepped out of sight. Walter kept checking the road between calls on the ranch radio, waiting for word from the rescue unit. By late afternoon, the answer finally came through the static. A convoy would arrive the next morning. That night, the calf bedded down near the porch instead of under the pump tower. Walter noticed, but said nothing. He sat outside longer than usual, hat in his lap, looking over the yard as darkness thickened around them. Once, near midnight, the calf lifted his head and gave a small shake, just enough to make the bell answer in the dark. Walter looked up at once. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'm here." And for the last time before the rescue came, that seemed to be enough. The convoy arrived just after sunrise, raising a ribbon of dust that the calf noticed long before Walter heard the engines. He had been standing near the porch, half asleep in the mild morning light, when his head came up and the bell gave one alert, uncertain note. By the time the first truck rolled into view, he was already pressed close to the side of the pump shed, watching the road with his whole body. Walter rose from his chair more slowly than he wanted to. Pain had settled deep into his back during the night, and grief had gotten there first. He did not wave when the vehicle stopped. Dr. Rebecca Cole stepped down from the lead truck with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years walking into scenes already heavy with fear. Ethan Pike and Simon Dube followed, keeping their movements measured as they took in the yard, the trough, the bell, the calf. No one tried to rush the separation. Rebecca spoke too. Walter first, asking practical questions in a voice that made room for difficulty. How long had the calf been alone? What had he eaten? Had he shown signs of infection, limping, nightmares, aggression? Walter answered in short pieces, but his eyes kept drifting back to the calf, who had gone utterly still. The bell did not move. Even silence around it now seemed like a form of speech. When Rebecca stepped closer, the calf watched her the way young wild things watch fire, drawn to it, afraid of it, unable to decide whether it brings warmth or destruction. She did not reach for him. She only stood at an angle, hands low, speaking softly enough that the words themselves hardly mattered. The calf's ears shifted once, his trunk lifted. Then it lowered again, not in surrender, but in a careful, trembling calculation. Walter had expected force. Nets, poles, sedatives, the kind of clean professional removal that would leave no space for feeling. Instead, Rebecca asked if the calf had followed him the night before. Walter said yes. She asked if he came when Walter moved toward the truck. The old man hesitated, then walked a few slow steps into the yard. After one long moment, the calf followed, the bell giving a single, hollow knock against his chest. That was how it happened. Not by capture, but by reluctant trust borrowed from one human and extended to another. Walter walked toward the rear supply truck. The calf shadowed him in silence until the tailgate came into reach. Then he paused, tested the height with his trunk, and after a brief, awkward scramble, hauled himself up among the feed sacks and tied down crates. Ethan looked stunned. Simon only shook his head and muttered that some animals chose their own fate before people ever understood it. Walter did not touch him goodbye. He came close enough to see the rubbed patch beneath the bell strap and the fine dust caught in the calf's lashes, but he kept his hands to himself. The calf, meanwhile, had curled into the corner of the truck bed, legs tucked under, eyes moving between Walter and the strangers with a quiet intensity that made everyone else instinctively lower their voices. The bell rested against the wood, as if even it were waiting. The road to the rehabilitation center ran east along the drier edge of the delta, through scrub country and open stretches where heat shimmered by mid-morning. At first, the calf rode in rigid silence, absorbing each bump like an insult. The smell of fuel, canvas, medicine, and unfamiliar humans crowded around him. Every few minutes, the truck bed jolted hard enough to make the bell chime, and each time his head jerked as though he had momentarily forgotten where he was. By the time they reached the center near the Okavango fringe, the calf looked more exhausted than frightened. The facility itself was designed to calm both animals and donors. Clean fencing, shade structures, fresh water, low voices, routines. Rebecca had built her life around places like this, around the belief that order and patience could carry broken creatures back toward the world they had lost. The calf stepped down from the truck and refused that order at once. He did not bolt. That would have been easier to interpret. Instead, he stood in the quarantine pen they prepared for him and turned to face the far corner, as if orienting himself against invisible pressure. He ignored the trough of formula. He ignored the stacks of fresh-cut browse. He ignored the curious orphan calves in the neighboring enclosure who reached their trunks through the rails, offering the first tentative invitations of his own species. He answered none of it. The only thing that changed him was any movement toward the bell. One of the vet techs, a tired woman named Marisol Trent, crouched to inspect the abrasion beneath the strap and barely brushed the leather before the calf slammed backward with such force that he cracked a weathered support board. The entire pen rang with impact. His ears went flat, his trunk curled tight, and the bell exploded into a wild metallic clamor that made everyone on the other side of the rails step back. Rebecca called an immediate stop. Marisol retreated. Ethan muttered that the strap would cause worse damage if they left it alone. And he was not wrong. But being right was useless in the face of what the calf was showing them. This was not stubbornness, not ordinary distress. The young elephant looked as though their fingers had reached toward the last surviving beam in a collapsing structure. Rebecca had seen panic before. This was something more organized, more desperate. The first night passed badly. The calf did not lie down. He stood under the shade roof until dusk, then in the open until moonrise, then shifted to the fence line where the other orphans occasionally rumbled in their sleep. He never answered them. Twice he moved toward the trough, then stopped and backed away. Near midnight, Rebecca returned with a flashlight and saw him standing perfectly still, listening to the faint movement of insects in the grass, as if waiting for a sound that belonged to another life. By the third day, his refusal had hardened into something dangerous. He would take water if no one watched too closely, but he turned away from formula and browse with a kind of solemn indifference that frightened Rebecca more than rage would have. An angry animal still believed in the world enough to fight it. This calf seemed to be withdrawing his consent from survival itself. The bell no longer rang often. When it did, it sounded less like protest than mourning. On the fifth evening, the crisis finally broke open. Rebecca was crossing the yard toward her quarters when a crack of wood split the dark, followed by the explosive clang of iron. She ran to the quarantine pen, in time to see the calf hurl himself against the fence line, not blindly, but with deliberate force aimed at one weak support post. He backed up, charged again, and the bell screamed around his neck with every impact, as if the sound itself were part of the escape. Ethan shouted for a restraint team, but Rebecca raised her arm before anyone could move. She stepped to the rail alone, heart beating hard enough to blur her hearing, and the calf stopped mid-charge to face her. Dust clung to his skin. A fresh smear of blood darkened the bridge of his forehead. For one suspended second, they looked at each other across the broken geometry of the pen, and Rebecca felt the first unmistakable crack in everything she thought she knew about rehabilitation. Rebecca did not sleep that night. Long after the rest of the center had gone quiet, she sat at the small metal desk in her quarters with a field recorder, a legal pad, and 5 days of sound files pulled from the microphones mounted near the quarantine fence. Outside, the wind moved through the thorn scrub in dry whispers. Inside, she kept replaying the same harsh scatter of bell strikes until noise began to separate into pattern. At first, she thought exhaustion was inventing order where none existed. The human mind was good at that, especially when guilt and worry had already softened its edges. But the more she listened, the less random the bell became. There were short paired notes that appeared before feeding times, rapid jagged bursts whenever staff approached too quickly, and long silences that fell only when the calf stood in rigid stillness, as if withholding the sound took effort. By dawn, Rebecca had covered 3 pages with observations she could not yet explain. The bell changed with context, not just louder or softer, faster or slower, but structurally. There were sequences that repeated under the same conditions, like phrases practiced into reflex. She listened again to the moment Ethan had moved toward the strap on the truck, again to the pen collision, again to the quiet early morning stretches when the calf believed no one was studying him. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It settled into her in layers, each one harder to deny than the last. The calf was not merely reacting to the bell. He was using it. Somewhere in the long months before he reached the center, he had turned that crude iron object into an extension of himself, a way to signal hunger, alarm, location, maybe even recognition. The bell was not an attachment. It was a language built out of necessity. That morning, Rebecca canceled every non-essential intervention and told the staff to stop trying to solve the calf. Marisol looked skeptical. Ethan looked openly frustrated. Simon, who had seen stranger things in the bush than most men would admit, only leaned against the rail and listened. "You think he's talking with it," he said. Rebecca did not answer right away. She was not ready to make it sound simple by saying yes. Instead of bringing formula or training tools, she brought a stool and sat outside the quarantine pen at sunrise. She did not call to the calf. She did not coax him toward the trough. She did not make herself interesting. She simply sat with a notebook in her lap while he stood in the far corner, bell hanging motionless, his body shaped by watchfulness and refusal. 2 hours passed that way, quiet enough for birdsong to start sounding intrusive. On the second morning, he shifted when she shifted. On the third, the bell gave 2 soft notes just after she rose to leave. Rebecca stopped, turned slightly, and waited. Nothing followed. Still, it was the first sound directed into shared space rather than private distress. She wrote the time down and came back before dawn the next day, taking the same seat, wearing the same jacket, carrying the same dented metal mug, so the ritual itself would remain unchanged. A pattern formed between them that no one else at the center quite understood. Rebecca learned that when the calf was frightened, the bell rattled high and uneven, with no room between strikes. When he was searching for a known presence, the notes came spaced and deliberate, as though he were sending sound outward and listening for the world to answer. When he settled, truly settled, the bell almost disappeared, disturbed only by breath and small shifts of weight. On the 6th morning of those silent sessions, Rebecca made the smallest change she had allowed herself. When the calf gave a low, measured pair of bell notes and then stilled, she lifted one finger and tapped the rim of her mug twice with her thumbnail. The sound was thin and human, and nowhere near the depth of iron against a young elephant's chest, but it was enough to travel. The calf's ears moved forward. He did not retreat. After that, the distance between them changed by inches, not yards. He began to leave the far corner and stand closer to the fence, while keeping his body angled for escape. Sometimes he would lift his trunk into the air between them, reading her scent, her stillness, whatever calm she managed to hold. Rebecca never reached out. Once, Ethan whispered that she was wasting valuable recovery time. Simon quietly told him he had no idea what recovery looked like in this case. Then Nora Bennett arrived. She came without warning in a dust-covered truck from town, asking for Rebecca by name and standing awkwardly by the office door, as if she already regretted the drive. The anger she had worn so hard in Walter's yard was gone now, worn thin by something heavier. She said she only needed to see the calf once. Rebecca should have refused, but something in the woman's face suggested this visit had been building long before it became a plan. They stood together outside the quarantine rail while the calf watched from shade. Nora's eyes fixed on the bell first, then on the rubbed patch beneath the strap. For a long time, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice had the flatness of someone confessing to weather, because weather cannot judge. The night the mother died, she had been the one who told her brother to turn the fence current higher, not to kill, just to stop the raids, just to save what little they had left. "I keep hearing that bell in my head," she said, "even when he's nowhere near me." Rebecca looked over at her then, understanding something she had not let herself name before. The bell had become more than a tool for the calf. It had become a moral echo for the humans around him, carrying grief, blame, protection, and fear from one life into another. Nora wiped her face once, angry at herself for doing it, and asked whether the animal hated people now. Rebecca looked back at the calf, who was standing closer than he had when Nora first arrived. "No," she said. "I think he hates losing the only thing that ever helped him be understood." Saying it aloud sharpened the truth into something irreversible. The bell was not valuable because of memory alone. It was valuable because when the calf lost his mother, his herd, and any stable world he recognized, he had made a voice out of metal and rhythm. Remove the bell too soon, and he lost that voice. The first real breakthrough came the next morning. Rebecca had taken her usual place outside the pen before sunrise, the air still cool, the rest of the center not yet awake. The calf approached in a slow, careful line until he stood only a few feet from the fence. Then, for the first time since arriving, he lowered his head in a posture that held no challenge in it at all. The bell came to rest without sound. Rebecca stayed perfectly still. A few seconds passed. Then the calf lifted his trunk and released a soft, uncertain rumble from deep in his throat. Not the full-bodied call of a confident young elephant, but something older than the bell and more fragile. The sound was brief, almost embarrassed by its own existence. After it faded, he turned, walked to the feeding trough he had ignored for days, and began to eat. Rebecca did not move until tears had already blurred the page beneath her pen. By afternoon, the staff wanted to call it a victory, but Rebecca knew better. This was not a cure. It was permission. The calf was allowing a new language to stand beside the old one, not replace it overnight. Still, the center felt different after that. The bell rang less from panic and more from habit. The neighboring orphans drew nearer, and for the first time, the story around the calf was no longer about what he refused to surrender, but about what he might slowly, painfully, learn to carry beyond it. By the time the dry season turned and the first distant storms began rebuilding the sky, the bell no longer ruled the rhythm of the calf's days. It still hung at his chest, worn smooth at the edges, and restrung twice as he grew, but its voice had softened into something occasional rather than constant. He spent more time among the other young elephants now, learning the small negotiations of shared space, the trunk touches, the quiet warnings, the rough play that ended in dust and forgiveness. Rebecca watched that change with the careful attention of someone who knew recovery could disguise itself as progress until one sharp moment proved otherwise. But the calf kept moving forward. He ate without being coaxed. He slept lying down some nights, which had once seemed impossible. He answered the low rumbles of the others with awkward little sounds of his own, then stronger ones, each week adding some new confidence to the old uncertainty that had shaped him. He formed his closest bond with two other young bulls, one broad-headed and reckless, the other smaller and strangely patient. Together, they moved through the rehabilitation grounds like a shifting weather system. Dust, shoving, splashing, long intervals of stillness under thorn shade. The calf still used the bell when startled, and sometimes when searching, but less often now. More and more, he seemed to be remembering that his own body had other ways to speak. Walter came only once that year. The drive from the pump station took too much out of him, and age had begun collecting its debts faster than before. When he stepped out of Simon Dube's truck at the edge of the center, he looked thinner, his shoulders bent inward as if protecting some private ache. The calf saw him from across the enclosure and stopped so suddenly the other young elephants nearly ran past him. For one suspended second, nothing happened. Then the calf crossed the yard at an uneven trot, not wild with excitement, not frantic, but deeply certain. Walter stopped at the rail and removed his hat, and the old man's face shifted in a way Rebecca had never seen before. The calf reached the fence, lifted his trunk, and breathed Walter in from boots to hands to the dust in the seams of his shirt. The bell gave one low note, and Walter laughed through tears. He made no attempt to hide. He did not ask to enter the enclosure. He did not ask the calf to remember anything more than presence. Rebecca stood a short distance away, giving both of them the privacy of not being alone. Walter spoke softly about ordinary things: the road, the heat, a water pump he still hadn't fixed, the goats that kept breaking the same stretch of fence. The calf listened with his trunk resting through the rails, and every so often the bell moved gently, like the last trace of an old accent. After that visit, the calf changed again. Not worse, not better in any simple sense, just altered, as though some unfinished circle inside him had closed enough to let him lean more fully into what came next. He followed the other young bulls more readily. He spent less time at the perimeter fences. When early morning came, he no longer stood waiting for silence to answer him. He had a herd now, however temporary. That fact began to settle into his bones. At 18 months, Rebecca marked his file for release consideration. He had the size, the independence, the growing wariness of humans that every successful reintegration required. He no longer looked toward people first when uncertain. He looked to the other elephants. That was the goal. That was what the center had been built for. Yet when she wrote the recommendation, her gaze kept drifting to the bell sketched in the margin of her own notebook like a thought she could not file away. The date was set for a moon-waning morning, when darkness would still cover the first miles of freedom, and the heat would not force the young bulls into early shelter. On the night before release, Rebecca walked out to the holding area alone. The 3 elephants stood together beyond the gate, their bodies silvered faintly by starlight. The calf, no longer really a calf, not anymore, stood nearest the fence. When she approached, the bell gave a small, familiar knock that reached her before memory could. She had brought wire cutters in one hand and nothing in the other. That was the part she had postponed until the last possible hour. For months, she had known he could not go into the wild carrying a bell that might catch in brush, betray his location, or mark him as vulnerable to the wrong eyes. But knowing a thing was necessary did not make it easy. The metal at his chest had once been his only workable bridge back to meaning. When she stepped inside the holding area, the other 2 young bulls moved off a pace or two, watchful but calm. He stayed where he was. Rebecca took another step, then another, until she stood close enough to see the pale scar under the strap and the soft dust gathered in the folds of his skin. "It's time," she said, though the words were for herself as much as for him. The young elephant lowered his head without resistance. Her fingers shook more than she wanted them to as she gathered the worn leather strap. The bell was cool in her palm, heavier than it looked, shaped by months of contact into something almost familiar to her own hand. When the cutters bit through the leather, the release was instant and absolute. No struggle. No backward leap. Just the sudden transfer of weight from his body into hers, and a silence so complete it felt like standing inside a held breath. Outside the fence, Walter had come after all. Simon had driven him in before dawn, and now the old man stood with one hand gripping the rail, hat forgotten against his chest. He watched Rebecca step back with the bell in her hand, and the young elephant standing bare-necked in front of her. Walter did not speak. He only nodded once, as though acknowledging a truth neither of them could afford to dress up as comfort. The gate swung open with a groan of metal and hinge. The larger of the two companion bulls moved first, cautious at the threshold, then committed. The second followed. For a brief moment, the young elephant who had once stood beside his dead mother, who had once spoken to the world in rusted iron, because grief had left him no other instrument, remained still in the opening. Rebecca felt her own heart stall in that pause. Then he stepped forward and disappeared into the dark with the others. She stood there long after the dust settled, the bell hanging silent in her hand. Around her, the center was already returning to routine. Keepers moving, radios crackling, gates closing, another day beginning whether anyone was ready or not. But for Rebecca, the silence that followed him felt immense. For so long, some part of her mind had been tuned to that metallic voice, reading fear, hunger, searching, memory. Now all of that had passed beyond the reach of iron. The first field report came 2 hours later. The 3 young males had covered more ground than expected and made contact with a small matriarchal group near a shallow watercourse. The interaction was cautious, but not hostile. Trunk touches, scent checks, protective repositioning by the adult females. Rebecca logged each detail with trained precision, yet her eyes kept returning to the bell on her desk as though the real report had not arrived yet. It came before noon. The tracker's voice on the radio held something like wonder. The released group had been vocalizing steadily, and the newly accepted young bull, the one from the center, the one with the bell scars, had begun responding with low, structured rumbles that carried across distance with surprising confidence. Not the halting attempts of an isolated orphan relearning species behavior. Something fuller, something translated. The old language had not trapped him. It had prepared him. Rebecca closed her eyes then and understood what she had only been approaching in fragments all those months. He had never clung to the bell because he loved the object itself. He had clung to it because, in the worst wound of his life, it had become the first thing that answered when he moved, the first thing that let him signal fear, need, presence, and search into a world emptied of mother and herd. It had been his voice until the rest of his voice could return. That evening, Walter stood in Rebecca's office doorway while the sun burned low over the scrub and asked the question he had driven all that way, pretending not to carry. "Do you think he'll remember me?" he said. Rebecca looked from the old man to the bell resting on her desk. "Yes," she said after a moment. not as a cage, as a way back. Walter bowed his head, and for once, the silence between them did not need translating. Rebecca did not place the bell in the archive after all. Instead, she carried it to the quiet end of the rehabilitation yard where newly rescued animals spent their first frightened days learning that survival could still continue after shock. She hung it beneath the shade roof where morning light would find it first, not as a relic, not as a monument, as a reminder that some broken creatures do not need to be corrected before they can be saved. They need to be heard long enough to remember who they are. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe that little bell was more than metal, leave a 0. And if you think Milo never forgot the people who helped him survive, tell us with just one word. Remembered. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many more powerful stories waiting for you in the next video. Stay with us. The next story may be the one you never forget.